The segment had barely been on air for 3 minutes when the tension between Laura Ingraham and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett began to thicken like storm clouds over a summer field. Fox News had promoted the interview as a civil discussion on foster care policies and family law, but anyone who had seen Ingraham's recent history with political guests knew that civil was rarely how these segments ended. Jasmine Crockett, dressed in a deep blue suit and a calm, measured smile, had arrived prepared. She had notes, she had statistics, and she had her unwavering ability to remain composed under fire. What she didn't expect, though perhaps she should have, was the personal jab Ingraham would deliver within minutes. "Well, Congresswoman," Ingraham began, leaning back in her chair with that trademark smirk, "you talk a lot about family values, but it's funny because I've heard stories about your own family that don't exactly paint the perfect picture. Some might say," she paused for effect, her eyes narrowing, "that you're in no position to preach about how others raise children." The studio seemed to freeze. For a moment, the camera even lingered too long on Jasmine's expression, her eyes slightly wider, lips pressed into a tight line. Ingraham had crossed a line. Not political, but deeply personal. Crockett leaned forward, her voice low but razor sharp. "Laura, you have every right to challenge my policies, my votes, my ideas, but when you come from my family, you're crossing into territory you might not want to walk into." Ingraham chuckled. "Oh, don't get so dramatic. It's just that your history doesn't exactly scream family advocate." Crockett took a breath, glancing briefly at the floor before locking her gaze back on Ingraham. "You want to talk family." Her tone was shifting from defensive to deliberate. "You might want to tread carefully, because I know about your family too. And I'm not talking rumors, I'm talking facts." The audience in the studio leaned forward. The producers, somewhere behind the cameras, were likely signaling to cut to commercial, but Crockett didn't give them the chance. "You've made a career out of preaching morality and so-called family values, yet you conveniently leave out the messy truth about your own history with adoption, truths the public deserves to hear." Ingraham's smile faltered for the first time. "Excuse me," she said, though her voice was less steady now. "Oh, don't act like you don't know what I'm referring to," Crockett pressed on. "The questionable processes, the connections that bypassed normal procedures, the stories you've worked very hard to keep out of the headlines. Do you really want me to go there, Laura? Because I have the receipts." The studio erupted, not in applause, but in the sharp inhale of an audience sensing a historic live television moment. The control room was in chaos. Producers debated whether to cut the feed or ride the wave of viral potential. Meanwhile, Ingraham tried to regain control, but Crockett had shifted into full prosecutor mode. "You've spent years painting yourself as the face of compassionate adoption," Crockett continued, "but the truth is, there's nothing compassionate about using political influence to bend the rules. There's nothing compassionate about sidelining legitimate applications from families who had been waiting for years, just so you could jump the line." Ingraham straightened in her chair, shaking her head. "That is a ridiculous and defamatory accusation." "Defamatory?" Crockett shot back. "Then explain the 2008 case." "Yes, I'm talking about the one where the paperwork was mysteriously expedited through a judge you'd personally hosted at a fundraiser. Explain why those records were sealed against the objections of the county clerk. Explain why a social worker on that case resigned in protest." "Should I keep going?" The audience murmured now, whispers spreading like wildfire. Even the camera operator's hands seemed unsteady, zooming in and out as if trying to capture every facial twitch. Ingraham's usual arsenal, sarcasm, deflection, and quick interruptions, was failing her. Crockett was relentless. "You can lecture me all you want about my family," Jasmine said, "but unlike you, I didn't manipulate a system that's supposed to protect vulnerable children. And before you start claiming I'm making this up, I'll remind you, you might have kept the public records buried, but you couldn't bury the witnesses. Some of them have already spoken to investigative reporters. And if you'd like, I can give you the names on live TV." Ingraham's hands gripped her pen tightly, the only sign of her fraying composure. "That's enough," she said, her voice strained. "We're not here to talk about me." "Oh, I think we are," Crockett replied. "You made it about me, my family, my values. Well, now the audience gets to see yours. And believe me, Laura, I've got nothing to hide." For a few agonizing seconds, silence hung over the studio. The air felt heavier. The cameras caught every micro-expression on Ingram's face, every flicker of calculation as she decided whether to keep fighting or retreat. Finally, Ingram forced a smile. "Well, Congresswoman, I suppose you've made your point. We'll move on." But everyone watching knew the conversation wouldn't be moving on. Not in the media, not on social platforms, and certainly not in the court of public opinion. By the time the segment ended, hashtags were already trending, #AdoptionGate and #Crockett vs Ingram. The fallout came fast. Within hours, investigative journalists began publishing old court documents and interviews that lent credibility to Crockett's claims. The next day, Ingram's PR team released a statement denying any wrongdoing, but the damage had been done. Sponsors began to distance themselves. Political allies went silent. As for Jasmine Crockett, she returned to Capitol Hill the next morning with the same calm smile she'd worn at the start of the interview. Only now, it was the smile of someone who had won a battle without raising her voice, just by speaking the truth at exactly the right moment. And somewhere deep inside Fox News headquarters, executives were quietly adding her name to the very short list of guests Laura Ingraham would probably never face again.